We're continuing our series on where is God. Last week we talked about the ways God is in the wilderness, in the difficult places of life. And today we're looking at the particular ways that God is at the borderland, crossing the border. If we want to know where God is in the immigration conversation, if we want to know where God is at the borders, national borders, the borders of society, the Bible's fairly clear that God is crossing the border. And that certainly changes the nature of the conversation. There is a restaurant in Park Slope in Brooklyn where the owner is a recent immigrant, and the employees are all immigrants from different countries, the cooks, the chefs, the waiters, everyone who works in the restaurant. And so the owner has placed at the bottom of the receipt, when you get the receipt after you leave, immigrants make this country great, and in parentheses also cooked your food and served your food today. So that reminds us of the great contributions that immigrants make to our society, culturally, economically, in terms of so many different ways. And this, I guess, in a certain way kind of offsets the other side of the immigration debate we hear, where that immigrants pose some kind of danger. Immigrants somehow threaten our jobs. There's a whole litany of reasons why people want to put up around immigrants being a problem in some way. And maybe those are the two poles of the debate. Now, if that is so, then the two poles of the debate basically have one assumption in common. And the assumption is that it is citizens of the United States, residents of the United States, who have the right to make this decision. That somehow we have a particular privilege here, a particular reason and ability to make the judgment. And that gives rise to a whole bunch of other stuff in the debate. You know, people say, well, I kind of went through the hoops myself. I went through the process. Why shouldn't other people go through the process, and so on. But the Bible does not accept that premise. The idea that people who live here have some kind of special privilege to make judgment over people who have come here more recently is not a biblical presence. It's not recognized as a biblical premise. So the whole question of whether immigrants should come here because of what they bring, what they contribute, what they can add to the society is not the reasoning that we find in the Bible. The reasoning in the Bible is that immigrants can come here because people migrate. It's been happening for centuries. It's part of the human experience. I've been looking into my own ancestry over the last few weeks and have discovered that my tribe, the Cunningham tribe, began basically in Scotland in around 1200 and eventually went down to Ireland and then came to Ohio. Well, around 1200, there were already people in Ohio. It was the Monongahela people were already in Ohio. And then when my tribe began to move south into Northern Ireland around the early to mid 1600s, then there was also some shift happening in Ohio, and the Monongahela were kind of being driven out in some ways. The Iroquois and the Algonquin began to rise up at that time. And then as my folks began to come across the Atlantic Ocean and make their way into eastern Ohio, the native people were being driven out. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by Andrew Jackson, essentially militarily took the people who were native to the region where my people then called home and drove them out. So that when my folks arrived around 1833, they were coming into a space that had been cleared. And I think this poses maybe the most important distinction when it comes to immigration is whether it's immigration or invasion. And the immigration that came from Europe in the 16, 17, and 1800s was more of an invasion than an immigration. Now, if people were coming across the border into the United States today with full-blown militaries and weaponry and were driving everyone out, that might be one thing. But immigration, people just crossing the border, is something that's known throughout human history. An article in the New Internationalist back in 1991 talked about human history is the history of migration. That's what people do. Now, biblically speaking, we're looking today at this text that's one of the real fundamental texts of the Hebrew Scriptures back in Deuteronomy that just kind of lays out the law. And if we simply updated it and said instead of "So now, O Israel," because it's addressed to Israel, if we just said "So now, United States of America," what does the Lord require of you? Only to fear and serve your God, to keep the commandments, for your God is great and awesome. Why? Because our God is not partial, takes no bribe, executes justice for the orphan and the widow, loves the stranger, providing them with food and clothing. God has a particular partiality for people moving across borders. You shall love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. We could all talk about our own family histories of migration. All of our families, I would guess, have moved at some point across history. And God is with us in that migration process. So we come to today in the United States, and we have a particular crisis around immigration in the United States. Why? Is it because of people who are coming across the border from Latin America and Africa and Asia and the Middle East? No, the crisis of immigration today is related to the immigration of Europeans into the United States in the 16 and 1700s. That's the crisis. The crisis is that it was not an immigration, it was an invasion, and that invasion included not only North America, it also included Latin America and South America, and really the rest of the world. So I hear people talking about how, this little girl that was on the picture of Time magazine who had come from Honduras and was being separated from her mother and is facing Donald Trump, and people want to say, well, she shouldn't have come. Well, Julio could give you a whole bunch of information about Honduras, about how the United States has gone into Honduras, has invaded Honduras, has helped overthrow the government of Honduras when a democratically elected president recently, just last year, was risen, and then the current president would not relinquish power, and how the United States has supported the undemocratically non-elected president over the democratically elected president. So how do we get righteous, how do we get a moral tone about somebody who's fleeing violence that the United States created? Now, I know the situation better in the Philippines, but I understand from talking to other folks that it's very similar across the world. But the United States invaded the Philippines in 1898, just after the Philippines had won its independence from Spain. And they killed nearly 1 million Filipinos in the Philippine-American War, which is hardly in our history books. And then they forcibly colonized the Philippines. And in 1946, when they ostensibly gave the Philippines independence, over the next 30 years, for every dollar that came into the Philippines, $3.58 went out. They had so set up an economic system under colonial rule that even after so-called independence, money, resources continued to flow out. The United States set the Philippines up militarily as a source of raw materials to come into the United States, kept wages low. And that's a system that's going on throughout the world. So there is absolutely no justice issue about that people should be prevented from coming into this country. If there's a justice issue, it's that the United States needs to get out of all these countries where people are coming from. So the Bible is very clear here, and it's clear throughout the scriptures that migration is always a thing, that strangers are always moving in and out of different places. In our particular case, they're coming out of horrific situations that this country has created, or has at least been a part of creating. So the only thing to do is to welcome the stranger. That's the call. That's the only call, is to welcome those who are coming in. And sometimes that welcome includes standing up for justice for those who are coming in. Now, the situation currently is at a place of emergency. I was just reading an article yesterday in Business Insider, which is hardly a leftist publication as far as I know, but talking about reports of abuse of immigrant children as young as 14 who are hosted at the Shenandoah Valley Juvenile Center near Staunton, Virginia. A suit has been filed alleging, and with all kinds of testimony, that these teenagers have been beaten while handcuffed, locked up for long periods in solitary confinement. The testimony includes half a dozen sworn statements from Latino teens jailed there for months or years. Lawsuits speak of poor conditions, frequent physical searches, verbal abuse by staff often escalated into confrontation as frustrated children acted out, staff responding by physically assaulting youth, applying excessive amount of force, and going beyond what is needed to establish or regain control. Private prisons, nonprofits funded by government to detain children who have been taken from their parents. This is a humanitarian crisis of the highest order. Mothers are starting to speak out about children who were taken from them. One mother said, "My son is not the same since we were reunited. I thought that because he is so young, he would not be traumatized by this experience, but he does not separate from me. He cries when he does not see me. The behavior is not normal. In El Salvador, he would stay with his dad or sister and not cry. Now he cries for fear of being alone." This policy is traumatizing, impacting children's lives now, day by day. Trauma that may live with them for a lifetime. Olivia Caceres was separated from her 1-year-old son in November. The boy's father, who was seeking asylum, remains detained. It took 3 months for Caceres to get her son back from government custody. According to her testimony, she said that after reuniting with her toddler, he continued to cry. When we got home, would hold onto my leg, would not let me go. When I took off his clothes, he was full of dirt and lice. It seemed like they had not bathed him in the 85 days he was away from us. Now, there are so many situations that we deal with in our faith, and we are often called to look at grace and to understand ways that God is moving in difficult situations. And there are also times that are so clear that the calling is to take action. I mean, there really is not much more to say. This is such a horrific situation, such an unjust situation, that in my reading of the scriptures, there is nothing to do but to act. at this point. There's nothing to do but find ways that we can offer hospitality and that we can stand up for justice in this situation. I've had some conversation with Nilbia, whose full-time work is around immigration, and many others of us are very deeply involved in this. On your bulletin this morning, there are 5 steps we can take. And I'm not going to talk much longer because really I don't think there's anything more to say. So I want to allow a little bit more time for us to talk in conversation circles so that we can really get at what are we called to do? What concretely is our congregation called to do at this time? So this is a list, and others there's a lot more. Lisa sent out a list this week that included a lot more options. But one option is fostering a child. There are children being held right here in our community. I know Catholic Charities, I think, that is offering a way to do adoption or to do foster child relationships. Host families must live in the Bronx and must be fluent in Spanish. Applicants will be in the program to serve unaccompanied children, not only separated children. And I wonder if there were 1 or 2 among us maybe who would feel called to take that kind of step, maybe others of us would also step up and help provide child care, maybe it could be a family, a community kind of thing. It feels to me like if these children are in our area, we certainly ought to be finding ways for progressive people of faith to be involved in these children's lives. Because if they're going to be sent out to foster spaces, we need to know that those situations they're in are as safe as possible. So that may be a thing. If a couple of us wanted to step up and do that, and then maybe the whole community comes around to find ways we can support that. Secondly is certainly attending rallies and vigils. There have been a whole bunch of those. Many of us have already been out at those. I know of one that's coming up later on in July. I'm sure there'll be others that will be coming up, and we need to keep one another informed of those so that we can get out. Donating to organizations that, particularly those that support legal services and other support for people going through this immigration process. Connecting with Congress, particularly demanding that our senators and representatives oppose legislation like Senator Tillis's Keep Families Together and Enforce the Law Act, which is just a proposal that turns toward family incarceration in lieu of family separation, but really doing an active congressional advocacy, amplifying on social media. There may be a lot of other things that people think about. So I'm going to move toward a conclusion here and give us a chance to have a little bit longer conversation. And I'm going to invite the facilitators of the conversation circles to write down the things that seem most, if we can get some consensus among us around some particular actions that we want to take as a body, and of course all of us can be involved in doing things individually, but some things that we would want to do together, then that would be great. Now, obviously, this is an overwhelming situation. It's a situation that brings incredible fear, incredible anxiety, incredible sadness. Sometimes we can just feel depressed by the overwhelming, horrific nature of this. But I think one thing that's important to remember in times like these is that the Bible is written about times like these, and the Bible is always clear that God is with us in this. That we have a God that is greater than the perpetrators of horrific violence. We have a God of justice who is with those who are crossing the border, who is with those who advocate for those who are crossing the border. If we want to be connected deeply with God, it is good for us to connect with the God who is moving across the border. We have power. We have a source of strength. We need to find whatever channels we can. Jeff Sessions is a United Methodist. And so a number of us have taken advantage of a rather archaic part of our discipline, which allows us to actually bring charges against fellow United Methodists. So we have brought charges of child abuse against Jeff Sessions. And one of the great things about this is the Bishop of Alabama has to respond. I've gotten a letter from the Bishop of Alabama saying, we received your complaint, we referred it to you. You know, there are ways we can act. There are creative ways that we can take action. God has called us not only to struggle, but to win, to be victorious. God has called us to be a people who live together in love, not just cower in fear. So this is certainly a time for that. This is certainly a time for us to rise up, a time for us to be bold. We're going to celebrate Holy Communion together, which reminds us of our communal strength. We're going to go through our time of offering, our time of announcements, and then we'll have some time at the tables to really pray together, to search together, to talk together, to listen to one another. What is it that God is calling us to do in this time? Amen.